The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7B in the Monroe County Courthouse hummed with their usual monotonous drone, casting pale shadows across the worn wooden benches. Outside, a January storm battered Detroit with freezing rain, the kind that turned the streets into mirrors of black ice and kept most people indoors. But inside this particular courtroom, every seat was filled. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the collective breath of journalists, curious onlookers and family members whose lives had been forever marked by tragedy. This was no ordinary hearing. This was the sentencing of Marcus Holloway, a name that had dominated local news for 18 months, a name whispered in coffee shops and shouted on social media, a name that had become synonymous with evil in the eyes of many. Before we continue with this shocking story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our viewers around the world. And if you enjoy these dark, twisted tales that will keep you up at night, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next macabre story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's return to that cold January morning in Detroit, where Judge Patricia Reeves was about to make a decision that would leave everyone speechless. Marcus Holloway sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. At 34 years old, he appeared unremarkable. Average height, brown hair beginning to thin at the crown, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an almost scholarly appearance. He wore a grey suit that his public defender had likely borrowed from someone's closet, slightly too large in the shoulders. Nothing about his appearance suggested the monster the prosecution had painted him to be. But appearances, as Judge Reeves well knew, meant nothing. The charges were horrific. 3 counts of first-degree murder. The victims: Sarah Chen, 28, a pediatric nurse; David Morrison, 32, a high school teacher; and Elena Rodriguez, 25, a graduate student in social work. 3 lives cut short, 3 families destroyed, 3 futures erased. The prosecution had spent months building their case, brick by brick, creating an edifice of evidence that seemed unshakable. DNA evidence linked Holloway to all 3 crime scenes. His fingerprints were found on items belonging to each victim. Security footage placed him near the locations where the bodies were discovered. Cell phone records showed he had been in contact with each victim before their deaths, using burner phones he'd purchased with cash at various convenience stores across the city. The murders themselves were brutally methodical. Each victim had been subdued with chloroform, bound with industrial zip ties, and transported to abandoned buildings in Detroit's vast landscape of urban decay. The city's economic collapse had left behind countless empty structures: factories, warehouses, apartment buildings, places where screams went unheard and bodies could remain undiscovered for days or weeks. Sarah Chen's body had been found in an old automotive plant on the east side, her hands bound, a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. David Morrison was discovered in a foreclosed house in Highland Park, killed in the same execution-style manner. Elena Rodriguez met her fate in a crumbling warehouse near the riverfront, her death identical to the others. The pattern was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had called it one of the most open and shut cases in recent memory. Assistant District Attorney James Brennan stood now, his expensive navy suit a sharp contrast to Holloway's ill-fitting attire. Brennan was 45, with silver threading through his dark hair, and the confident bearing of someone who had won far more cases than he'd lost. He held a thick folder containing victim impact statements, photographs of the deceased in happier times, and a sentencing recommendation that called for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Your Honor," Brennan began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had delivered dozens of such statements, "the defendant before you is a predator who stalked, hunted, and executed 3 innocent people, 3 individuals who dedicated their lives to helping others, who had families that loved them, who had dreams and ambitions that will never be realized." He opened the folder and removed a photograph of Sarah Chen, smiling in her nursing scrubs, holding a newborn baby. Sarah Chen worked in the neonatal intensive care unit at Detroit Medical Center. She saved lives, premature babies, sick infants. She gave them a chance when others had given up hope. Her colleagues described her as the most compassionate person they'd ever known. Brennan placed the photo on the easel beside him and produced another image: David Morrison in a classroom surrounded by students. David Morrison taught American history at Cass Technical High School. He stayed late every day to tutor students who were struggling. He bought school supplies out of his own pocket for kids whose families couldn't afford them. He believed in second chances, in redemption, in the potential of every human being. A third photograph joined the others: Elena Rodriguez at her college graduation, her family surrounding her with pride. Elena Rodriguez was the first person in her family to attend graduate school. She was studying to become a therapist, specifically to work with trauma survivors and victims of violence. The irony of how she died is not lost on any of us. Brennan's voice hardened, his jaw tightening. This defendant showed no mercy, no compassion. He hunted these people like animals, lured them to isolated locations, and killed them in cold blood. The evidence against him is irrefutable. DNA, fingerprints, cell phone records, security footage, everything points to Marcus Holloway and Marcus Holloway alone. He turned to face the judge directly. The families of these victims will never see their loved ones again. They will never hear their voices, share another meal, celebrate another holiday. The defendant stole that from them. He deserves to spend every remaining day of his life behind bars, reflecting on the evil he has committed. The prosecution recommends life imprisonment, without parole on each count, to be served consecutively. Thank you, Your Honor. The courtroom was silent, except for the muffled sobs of Sarah Chen's mother, a small woman in her 60s, who had aged a decade in the past 18 months. Judge Patricia Reeves sat behind her bench, a commanding presence despite her slight frame. At 58, she had presided over Monroe County Superior Court for 12 years, earning a reputation for being tough but fair, methodical but not cold. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes held an intensity that made even seasoned attorneys nervous. She had reviewed every piece of evidence, read every transcript, examined every photograph. She had barely slept in the past week, haunted by the weight of the decision before her. "Does the defense wish to make a statement?" Judge Reeves asked, her voice measured and calm. Marcus Holloway's public defender, a young woman named Rebecca Torres, stood slowly. She was 29, relatively inexperienced, and had been assigned this case through the Public Defender's Office lottery system. It was the kind of case that could destroy a career before it even properly began. "Your Honor," Torres said, her voice betraying a slight tremor, "my client maintains his innocence. While we acknowledge the evidence presented by the prosecution, we believe there are significant questions about how that evidence was obtained and whether Ms. Torres—" Judge Reeves interrupted gently but firmly. "We are past the trial phase. The jury has rendered its verdict. We are here for sentencing." Torres nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, Your Honor. We ask the court to consider that my client has no prior criminal record. He has been a productive member of society, working as an IT specialist at a non-profit organization that provides computer training to underprivileged youth. He has letters of support from colleagues and friends who cannot reconcile the person they know with the crimes he has been convicted of." She placed a thin folder on her table. It contained perhaps a dozen letters, a pathetically small pile compared to the mountain of evidence against her client. "We ask for leniency, Your Honor. We ask that the court consider the possibility of rehabilitation of Ms. Torres," Judge Reeves said, her tone unchanged. "Do you have anything else to add?" The young attorney looked down at her notes, then at her client, then back at the judge. "No, Your Honor." "Does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Marcus Holloway rose slowly. His hands were shaking slightly, the only outward sign of emotion he had displayed throughout the entire trial. He looked at the judge, then at the families of the victims seated behind the prosecution's table. "I didn't do this," he said quietly. "I know you don't believe me. I know the evidence looks bad, but I didn't kill those people. I don't know how my DNA and fingerprints got there. I don't know why those cell phone records exist, but I didn't do this." Several family members made sounds of disgust and disbelief. Sarah Chen's mother turned away, unable to even look at him. "I think about those people every day," Holloway continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think about their families, about what they're going through, and I'm sorry you're suffering, but I didn't do this." He sat back down, his shoulders slumping forward. Judge Reeves was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded on the bench before her. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "Mr. Holloway, please stand," she finally said. He rose, Rebecca Torres standing beside him. "This court has presided over many difficult cases," Judge Reeves began, her voice filling the courtroom with quiet authority. "Cases involving violence, tragedy, lives destroyed by crime and cruelty. Each one weighs heavily, but the evidence guides us. The law guides us. Justice, we hope, guides us." She paused, looking down at the papers before her, then back up at Holloway. "In reviewing this case, I have spent countless hours examining every detail. The DNA evidence, the fingerprints, the cell phone records, the security footage, the timeline of events, the testimonies of witnesses, everything." James Brennan nodded slightly, confident in the verdict that was surely coming. "And I have found something troubling," Judge Reeves continued. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively. I have found that while the evidence against you is substantial, Mr. Holloway, there are inconsistencies that cannot be ignored. Small details that, when examined together, create a pattern that disturbs me greatly. Brennan's confident expression flickered. Your Honor, the jury has already... Mr. Brennan, I am aware of the jury's verdict, Judge Reeves said sharply, but it is my responsibility to ensure that justice is served, not merely that procedures are followed. She looked back down at her notes. The DNA evidence found at each crime scene was remarkably well preserved, despite the environmental conditions of the locations where the bodies were discovered. In the case of Sarah Chen, her body was exposed to the elements for nearly a week in an unheated building during a Michigan winter. Yet the DNA samples collected were pristine, almost textbook quality. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The fingerprints found on items belonging to each victim were complete, clear, and perfectly positioned, as if someone carefully pressed the defendant's fingers against these objects rather than them being deposited through normal handling. Rebecca Torres's eyes widened. She had raised these concerns during the trial, but the jury had dismissed them. The cell phone records show communication between burner phones and the victims, but no phone calls were ever completed. Only text messages. Messages that could be sent by anyone with access to those phones. Judge Reeves's voice grew harder, and the security footage, while it does show a person matching Mr. Holloway's general description near the crime scenes, never once shows a clear view of his face. The camera angles are always conveniently obscured. Brennan stood. Your Honor, with all due respect, the defense had the opportunity to present these arguments during trial. The jury considered them and found them unconvincing. We cannot simply... Sit down, Mr. Brennan, Judge Reeves commanded. The district attorney sat, his face reddening. Over the past week, Judge Reeves continued, I have done something unusual. I have conducted my own investigation into certain aspects of this case. I have consulted with forensics experts outside of those retained by either the prosecution or defense. I have reviewed financial records. I have examined evidence logs. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on her every word. And I have discovered that someone with access to the evidence room, someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures, someone with the technical skills to manipulate digital records and the connections to plant physical evidence, has been operating within the criminal justice system of this city. She looked directly at James Brennan. Mr. Brennan, where were you on the evening of October 15th, 18 months ago? The district attorney's face went pale. Your Honor, I don't understand. The evening Sarah Chen was murdered. Where were you? I would have been at home, or perhaps at the office. I don't recall specifically. It was 18 months ago. According to cell phone records I obtained through a separate warrant, your personal phone pinged off a tower less than half a mile from where Sarah Chen's body was found. At approximately the same time she was killed, gasps echoed through the courtroom. Several journalists scrambled for their phones. Brennan's hands were shaking now. That's circumstantial. I work all over the city. I could have been anywhere. On the evening of November 3rd, when David Morrison was murdered, your phone was in Highland Park. On December 12th, when Elena Rodriguez was killed, your phone was near the riverfront warehouse. Your Honor, this is outrageous, Brennan shouted. You can't possibly... DNA analysis that I requested independently has revealed something interesting, Judge Reeves continued, her voice growing colder. The DNA samples from each crime scene contained not just the defendant's DNA but trace amounts of a second profile. A profile that matches yours, Mr. Brennan. The courtroom erupted. Family members cried out. Reporters rushed for the doors. Bailiffs moved to maintain order. Brennan's face had gone from pale to crimson. This is absolutely absurd. I'm the prosecutor. My DNA would naturally be present on evidence that I've handled during the investigation. The DNA was found on the victims' bodies, Mr. Brennan, not on evidence you handled afterward. On the bodies themselves, specifically under Sarah Chen's fingernails, where she apparently scratched her attacker during the struggle. Rebecca Torres had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Further investigation revealed that you, Mr. Brennan, had personal connections to all three victims. Sarah Chen was the nurse on duty when your daughter was born 8 years ago, a birth that resulted in complications that left your daughter with permanent disabilities. You blamed Ms. Chen, though no malpractice was ever proven. Brennan was standing now, his chair knocked backward. My daughter has nothing to do with this. David Morrison taught at Cass Tech, the same high school your son attended. 2 years ago, Mr. Morrison gave your son a failing grade that cost him his scholarship to college. You confronted Mr. Morrison at the school, an incident that was documented in the principal's office. He destroyed my son's future, and Elena Rodriguez was a graduate student researcher who was studying prosecutorial misconduct. She had requested access to files from several of your cases. including 3 where wrongful conviction claims had been filed. She was getting close to discovering a pattern of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and manipulation that you had been engaging in for years. Judge Reeves stood now, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "You are a serial killer, Mr. Brennan, but you're not just a killer. You're a calculated predator who used your position within the justice system to not only murder innocent people, but to frame another innocent person for your crimes." Brennan's facade finally crumbled, his face twisted with rage and something else, something dark and violent that had been hiding behind the veneer of professional respectability. "You don't understand," he screamed. "They destroyed my family. Chen's incompetence left my daughter brain damaged. Morrison ruined my son's life. Rodriguez was going to destroy everything I'd built. They deserved what happened to them." Security officers were moving toward him now, but Brennan wasn't finished. And Holloway, pathetic, naive Holloway, he was perfect, so easy to manipulate. I worked with him at that non-profit years ago, before I became a prosecutor. I knew his routines, his habits. I knew he'd be easy to frame. I had access to everything I needed. His DNA from old coffee cups, his fingerprints from equipment at the non-profit. It was so simple. He laughed, a horrible sound that echoed off the courtroom walls. And everyone believed it. Every single person believed that boring, ordinary Marcus Holloway was a murderer. The evidence was perfect. The case was perfect. Except it wasn't, Judge Reeves said quietly. Evil, no matter how carefully planned, eventually reveals itself. The truth has a way of surfacing. 2 bailiffs grabbed Brennan's arms, but he thrashed against them, his professional demeanor completely shattered. "You can't prove any of this. The evidence against Holloway is still valid. He's been convicted. The evidence against Mr. Holloway is fruit of the poisonous tree," Judge Reeves said, "planted by a murderer to conceal his own crimes. This conviction is hereby vacated. Mr. Holloway, you are free to go." Marcus Holloway collapsed into his chair, his body shaking with sobs. Rebecca Torres embraced him, crying as well. "James Brennan, you are under arrest for the murders of Sarah Chen, David Morrison, and Elena Rodriguez, as well as charges of evidence tampering, perjury, and abuse of your position as an officer of the court. Officers, remove him from my courtroom." As Brennan was dragged away, still screaming his justifications, still clinging to his twisted logic, Judge Reeves sat back down heavily. The weight of what had nearly happened, an innocent man spending his life in prison while the real killer walked free, hung over the room like a storm cloud. The families of the victims sat in shocked silence. They had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that justice had been served. Now they faced the horrible reality that they had been manipulated by the very person who had murdered their loved ones. Sarah Chen's mother stood on unsteady legs and walked toward Marcus Holloway. He flinched, expecting anger or violence. Instead, she took his hands in hers. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Outside, the January rain had turned to snow, soft flakes falling on the city like tears from heaven. News vans were already setting up, reporters preparing to tell the story of how the most open and shut case in recent memory had been revealed as an elaborate frame-up perpetrated by the very prosecutor who had sought to put an innocent man away for life. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of James Brennan's crimes came to light. Forensic accountants discovered that he had embezzled money from seized assets to pay for his daughter's medical care. Digital experts found evidence of him tampering with files in other cases, potentially affecting dozens of convictions. The Michigan State Bar immediately began disbarment proceedings, though that seemed almost laughably inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. Marcus Holloway struggled to rebuild his life. 18 months in jail awaiting trial had cost him his job, his apartment, and many of his relationships. But Rebecca Torres worked tirelessly to help him, connecting him with resources and support groups. Slowly, painfully, he began to heal. The families of the victims faced a different kind of healing. They had lost their loved ones, had their grief manipulated by a monster, and had directed their anger at an innocent man. Some would never recover from that betrayal of trust, but others found a strange kinship with Holloway, all of them victims of James Brennan's calculated evil. Judge Patricia Reeves received both praise and criticism for her unprecedented investigation. Some legal experts argued she had overstepped her bounds, that judges should not conduct independent investigations. Others hailed her as a hero who had prevented a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. She declined to comment publicly, saying only that she had done what her conscience and her oath demanded. As for James Brennan, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, without possibility of parole, the very sentence he had sought for Marcus Holloway. In prison, he maintained that he had been justified, that his victims had deserved their fates, that he had only done what any father would do to protect his family. But late at night in his cell, when the sounds of the prison faded and he was alone with his thoughts, James Brennan faced the truth he had spent years running from. He was not a crusader for justice or a protector of his family. He was simply a man who had let his pain and rage consume him until there was nothing left but a monster wearing a prosecutor's suit. The case became legendary in legal circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, the importance of scrutinizing even the most convincing evidence, and the catastrophic consequences when those sworn to uphold justice become its greatest betrayers. And in Courtroom 7B of the Monroe County Courthouse, where fluorescent lights still hummed their monotonous drone and justice was sought day after day, a small plaque was installed on Judge Patricia Reeves's bench. It bore a simple inscription, a reminder to everyone who entered that room: the truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. Because the truth, as that cold January day had proven, is often more shocking, more twisted, and more macabre than any lie we tell ourselves. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who hide behind badges, suits, and the promise of justice.